On paper, the American economy is a masterpiece. GDP numbers hit historic highs, the stock market breaks records weekly, and unemployment figures look immaculate. If you read the official reports from Washington, the entire machine is humming perfectly. But step away from the macroeconomic triumphalism and look at the actual arithmetic of human survival. There is a quiet, suffocating anomaly unfolding across the country, one that standard metrics are completely blind to. It is the phenomenon of the secure yet broke. Families earning $90,000, $100,000, even $120,000 a year. Incomes that historically guaranteed a comfortable suburban life are sitting under kitchen lights late at night, staring at bank statements, trying to figure out where the money went. They are not buying luxury goods or overextending on exotic vacations. They are paying for a baseline existence: rent, groceries, healthcare premiums, and the compounding interest on the degrees they needed just to get through the door. They followed every line of the script handed down by their parents. Work hard, get an education, secure a professional job, live responsibly. Yet, the reward for that obedience is a persistent, low-grade financial panic that never truly fades. This isn't poverty in the traditional sense. Being poor means fighting for immediate survival today. This is a different kind of exhaustion. It is the experience of running as fast as you can on a treadmill just to hold position, watching a horizon that constantly recedes. It is the realization that the foundational promise of American life, the unwritten contract that each generation climbs higher and breathes easier than the last, has quietly, without an official announcement, expired. There is a sentence echoing through workplace break rooms, late-night text threads, and internet forums right now that cuts straight to the bone. I earn significantly more than my parents did at my age, and I live noticeably worse. That sentence isn't just a personal grievance. It is a structural verdict on a system that silently changed the rules of the game while keeping the propaganda exactly the same. Look at the physical symptoms of this breakdown. Millions of college-educated, full-time employed adults in their late 20s and 30s are moving back into their childhood bedrooms. This isn't a cultural preference or a sudden lack of ambition. It is the result of hard, unyielding math. The entry fee for an independent life has become entirely disconnected from the value of labor. In cities like Denver, Phoenix, Nashville, or Charlotte, places that used to be the geographic escape valves for young professionals fleeing overpriced coastal hubs, rents have effectively doubled in less than a decade. The cost of buying a median home has spiked to a point where ownership now requires an income that puts you in the top tier of earners nationally. The basic components of an ordinary life have been financialized, commodified, and priced as luxury items, and this is where the real paradox lives. If everyone is working, and everyone is earning more paper dollars than ever before, where is that wealth actually going? Why does a $90,000 salary buy the same standard of living that $50,000 did 3 decades ago? The answer isn't general inflation. It isn't just that eggs cost more or that gas prices fluctuated. It is something far more permanent. Over the past 3 decades, the core pillars of middle-class stability, housing, medical care, and higher education were systematically decoupled from regular wages. They were converted into high-yield extraction mechanisms. You no longer buy a life, you rent it. You subscribe to your existence through an invisible web of corporate landlords, insurance conglomerates, and institutional lenders who have optimized the system to extract maximum margin from every single American household. This structural shift is rewriting the rules of society in real time, altering human behavior at a primal level. People are delaying marriage, skipping having children, and avoiding long-term risks not because their values changed, but because the margin for error has shrunk to zero. One unexpected medical bill, one car transmission failure, or one corporate downsizing, and the entire fragile edifice collapses. This video is not a political debate. It is an autopsy of a quiet economic coup. Over the next 20 minutes, we are going to trace the exact historical moments the wires were crossed, the geographic traps that forced millions into unwinnable choices, and the hidden financial machinery that turned the American middle class into a permanent extraction pool. By the end of this, you will see exactly why the math stopped working, who holds the ledger, and what happens when a society completely runs out of forward momentum. Let's look at how the trap was set. To understand how the American middle class was funneled into this economic bottleneck, we have to look at a series of deliberate policy decisions, corporate maneuvers, and geographic realities that unfolded over the last 50 years. This was not an accident of nature. It was a structural redesign. The divergence began in earnest during the mid to late 1970s. For decades following World War II, a phenomenon known as the post-war economic consensus held true. As labor productivity rose, inflation-adjusted worker compensation rose in near-perfect lockstep. Between 1948 and 1973, productivity grew by 96.7%, while worker compensation grew by 91.3%. Wealth generated by technological advancement and efficiency was distributed back into the hands of the people doing the work. That relationship ruptured permanently in the late 1970s. Data from the Economic Policy Institute reveals that from 1979 to 2022, net productivity in the United States grew by 64.6%, while hourly compensation for the typical worker grew by just 14.8%. The vast surplus of wealth generated by American workers over the last 45 years did not vanish. It was systematically redirected upward into corporate profits, executive compensation, and financial markets. While a worker in 1965 made roughly 20 times what the average corporate CEO earned, by the early 2020s, that ratio had expanded to over 340 times. Wages stagnated in real terms, while the true cost of goods required to sustain a family continued to climb. This wage productivity gap was exacerbated by a profound structural shift in the American tax code. In 1981, the Economic Recovery Tax Act drastically cut the top marginal income tax rate from 70% to 50%, and by 1986, the Tax Reform Act dropped it further to 28%. The stated goal was to stimulate corporate investment and create a rising tide that would lift all boats. The reality was a massive accumulation of capital at the top of the economic pyramid, which fundamentally altered how assets were valued. Wealthy individuals and institutional funds needed a place to park this newly retained capital to generate yields, and they found their ultimate target in the foundational infrastructure of daily life: residential real estate. This is where the geographic trap closes around the modern worker. Throughout the mid-20th century, the American economy was distributed across a vast network of medium-sized manufacturing cities. A family could build a stable life in places like Akron, Flint, Erie, or Rockford. However, the rapid deindustrialization of the late 20th century, accelerated by corporate outsourcing and the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1993, gutted these regional manufacturing hubs. Between 2000 and 2010 alone, the United States lost approximately 5.7 million manufacturing jobs. Economic opportunity concentrated aggressively into a handful of Tier 1 knowledge economy metropolitan areas, cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, New York, and Boston. This geographical consolidation created a fierce inventory crisis. Workers were forced to migrate to the same dense job markets to secure employment, but the housing supply in those regions was structurally choked. Restrictive municipal zoning laws, historic preservation mandates, and local NIMBY, not in my backyard, activism prevented cities from building dense, affordable multi-family housing. In California, the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978 permanently capped property tax rates based on the 1975 assessment value, disincentivizing long-term homeowners from selling and reducing the fiscal incentive for local governments to approve new residential developments. As demand surged and supply remained artificially constrained, housing prices severed all ties with local median incomes. The final element of this trap was the systemic financialization of shelter, following the 2008 global financial crisis. When the subprime mortgage meltdown caused millions of American families to default on their loans, the federal government step-brokered massive liquid bailouts for Wall Street. The Federal Reserve slashed interest rates to near zero, a policy known as quantitative easing, pumping trillions of dollars of cheap capital into the financial system. Private equity firms and institutional asset managers, armed with virtually free money, recognized an unprecedented extraction opportunity. Firms like Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and American Homes 4 Rent entered the single-family housing market, buying up tens of thousands of foreclosed homes at steep discounts. In the years that followed, corporate capital altered the fabric of neighborhoods across the Sun Belt and the Midwest. In 2021, institutional investors purchased nearly 1/4 of all single-family homes sold in the United States, and in certain submarkets like Atlanta, Phoenix, and Charlotte, corporate buyers accounted for over 30% of all residential purchases. These institutions did not buy homes to flip them. They bought them to convert them into a permanent asset class of rental properties. A regular home buyer, relying on a standard mortgage pre-approval and saving for a down payment from an ordinary paycheck, found themselves outbid by institutional algorithms making all cash offers above the asking price with no contingencies. This brings us to the ultimate geographic and financial paradox of modern American life. To access a competitive corporate job, a worker must reside within or near an economically vibrant metropolitan area. However, the sheer volume of corporate capital and institutional investment in those specific real estate markets has driven the cost of rent and homeownership to levels that absorb 40, 50, or even 60% of that worker's net monthly income. The geographic centers of wealth creation have become financial exclusion zones for the very labor required to run them. The historic path to generational wealth accumulation through property ownership has been blocked by the same capital that funds the employers offering the jobs. The system created an inescapable cycle where working harder simply yields more capital for the entities collecting the rent. This economic containment zone is governed by a series of interlocking, high-yield extraction mechanisms that dominate the modern American household ledger. To analyze the exact nature of this crisis, we must look directly at the actual cash flows required for healthcare, education, and basic consumer survival. The modern worker does not just face higher prices, they face a highly sophisticated network of mandatory costs that effectively act as private taxes on baseline existence. The first core extraction mechanism is the American Medical Billing and Insurance System. According to data from the Kaiser Family Foundation, the average annual premium for employer-sponsored family health coverage reached $24,000 in recent years, with workers forced to contribute an ever-growing share directly from their gross pay. However, the premium is merely the entry fee. Over the past 2 decades, health insurance conglomerates have aggressively shifted structural costs onto consumers through high-deductible health plans. The average individual deductible has more than doubled since 2010, meaning a worker can easily pay $5,000 out of pocket for medical care. Before their insurance coverage contributes a single dollar, this financial vulnerability has turned medical emergency into an immediate driver of bankruptcy. A landmark study published in the American Journal of Public Health confirmed that medical issues contribute to approximately 66.5% of all personal bankruptcies in the United States. This structural reality forces a permanent state of financial vigilance upon households. Even with full-time corporate employment, a routine outpatient procedure, an emergency room visit for a child, or a chronic prescription requirement can instantly erase a family savings account. The consumer is trapped in a market where they cannot verify prices beforehand, cannot negotiate costs, and cannot opt out of the service. The second primary mechanism of wealth extraction is the federal student loan system. The transformation of higher education from a public good into an individual debt vehicle began accelerating in the late 20th century as state governments systematically reduced direct funding to public universities. To compensate for the loss of state revenue, universities raised tuition rates at a pace that vastly exceeded general inflation. Data from the National Center for Education Statistics shows that the average cost of undergraduate tuition, fees, room, and board at public 4-year institutions rose by more than 150% between 1990 and the early 2020s, adjusted for inflation, to fund this escalation. The federal government expanded the student loan infrastructure, creating a massive pool of non-dischargeable debt. Under current federal bankruptcy statutes, specifically provisions cemented by the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005, student loans are treated with an extreme standard of permanence, making them virtually impossible to wipe clean in bankruptcy court unless a debtor can prove undue hardship under a highly restrictive legal test. Total outstanding student loan debt in the United States surpassed $1.7 trillion, weighing down more than 43 million borrowers. A graduate entering the workforce with $50,000 in debt at a 6% interest rate begins their career with a mandatory monthly capital drain that delays home purchases, retirement contributions, and family formation by a decade or more. This structural squeeze has triggered a massive, compounding crisis in consumer credit. As the gap between real wages and mandatory living costs expanded, American households increasingly utilized credit cards and auto loans to bridge the monthly shortfall. By the mid-2020s, total U.S. household debt crossed historic thresholds, driven by rising balances in revolving credit. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York reported that credit card balances exceeded $1.1 trillion, while average credit card interest rates spiked past 21%. Following the central bank's aggressive interest rate hikes designed to combat post-pandemic inflation. This interest rate environment created a highly profitable spiral for commercial banks and credit issuers, while systematically draining liquidity from low and middle-income consumers. A worker carrying a routine $10,000 balance on a credit card at 22% interest faces an annual finance charge of $2,200 just to service the debt, without reducing the principal balance. This dynamic has driven delinquency rates on credit cards and auto loans to their highest levels since the 2008 financial crisis, particularly among borrowers in their 20s and 30s. The current corporate landscape has adapted to this lack of consumer liquidity by institutionalizing the buy now, pay later model for ordinary consumer purchases. Fintech platforms now intermediate standard retail transactions, allowing consumers to split $20 grocery runs or $50 clothing purchases into bi-weekly installments. This microfinancing of daily survival indicates that consumer liquidity has been entirely exhausted. The middle class is operating on a razor-thin margin where ordinary monthly consumption requires immediate short-term financing. The conflict has moved from an abstract macroeconomic debate into a direct confrontation between the population and the institutional framework. Municipalities and state governments find themselves caught between corporate property developers who demand tax incentives to build luxury developments and a workforce that cannot afford local shelter. Corporations report robust profits and record productivity gains, yet the workforce required to sustain those profits is increasingly turning to state assistance, food pantries, and multi-family co-living arrangements to survive. The financialized economy has achieved its ultimate goal: maximum efficiency in extracting capital from the population, resulting in a society that is fully employed, highly productive, and completely broke.